First tonight, the head of Ukraine's armed forces warns that Russia is gearing up for a new attack on the capital, Kyiv, in the new year. In a press interview, General Valery Zaluzny says he is preparing for Russian forces to have another go at taking the city, possibly in February or March. Meanwhile, Moscow has signaled there'll be no Christmas ceasefire after nearly 10 months of war, with fighting looking set to drag on through the winter. Here's our chief correspondent, John Cookson.
It's rare to see footage from Russian-controlled Donetsk in East Ukraine, but the authorities there want the rest of the world to see the result of what they say is an attack from Ukrainian rockets. It comes as officials in the city say there'll be no Christmas truce in this near 10-month-long war. An apartment block and a hospital were among the buildings damaged by the shelling. This man, speaking under Russian-controlled reporting restrictions, says, "I don't understand what it's all for. Those who live in the Donbass, they're loyal to Russia. It's not going to change. It's not going to be any other way," he said. Over 700 kilometers north in Kiev, they're still clearing up after Russian missile and drone strikes, which hit apartment blocks as well as city infrastructure like power plants. The obvious danger of the current Russian campaign to civilians is concerning one senior UN official speaking in Switzerland.
And missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities and hydroelectric power stations, are exposing millions of civilians, especially persons in situations of vulnerability, to extreme hardship during the winter months. And as you can imagine, it is so much colder in Ukraine than it is in Geneva. Over 10 million consumers are facing cuts in electricity, and millions are cut off from a regular supply of water and heat. Additional strikes could lead to a further serious deterioration in the humanitarian situation and spark more displacement.
On the Black Sea, a UN-brokered deal for Russian and Ukrainian grain exports is working, but still no agreement on Russian fertilizers, much needed by the rest of the world. There is, however, hope of a breakthrough.
I am cautiously optimistic that we can have important progress soon, but I really cannot share with you the details of all these negotiations. So in a way, I will say like a Mexican series many years ago said, yes and no. Yes, there has been progress. No, we are not yet where we need to be for fertilizers coming to the global market.
Зі святом, з Днем Збройних Сил України!
On a brighter note, one group of soldiers who will be home for the festive season are 64 Ukrainian servicemen and a US citizen. They're part of the latest prisoner swap with Russia, proving that despite bellicose statements on both sides, a glimmer of humanity still exists. John Cookson, Arise News.
And John Cookson joins me now from London. Good to see you, John. So the Kremlin saying there's no question of a Christmas truce or any troop withdrawals, and that Ukraine must accept Russia's territorial gain. So, as you said, the fighting looks like it's going to drag on indefinitely.
Hey, Charles. Yes, good to see you too. What a mess. I'm really worried about what's going on in Ukraine at the moment from the Ukrainian people point of view, because they're, of course, the ones that are suffering most. Look, some of the background to this is that about 3 weeks ago, journalists, including myself, got wind of some kind of peace deal in the offing, that there were back channels between Russia and the US, and possibly involving Turkey and also Saudi Arabia getting involved in smoothing the way to trying to find a position where both sides could agree a ceasefire. And suddenly that became a Christmas ceasefire, which in Europe is, of course, December the 25th, but in Ukraine and Russia, that's last part of the first week of January. So that's what was going on in the background, that this ceasefire could become from temporary to permanent, and that could lead to sit-down negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And my understanding of the deal was this, that Zelensky had to agree that the Russians keep Crimea and parts of the Donbass region, and in return, the Russians then would withdraw from elsewhere in Ukraine. Now, at some point, something's gone obviously badly wrong with all of this, and Moscow saying today that there will be no Christmas ceasefire, and there's certainly been an uptick of violence from the Russian side in cities like Kherson. So I think what's going on in the background is influencing what's now happening on the ground, and it seems that, as I say, I am deeply worried about what's going to happen in Ukraine, because no one's backing down at the moment, and both sides are going to go further in this terrible conflict. Look, we're looking for a way out. Everyone's looking for a way out on this, but it seems at the moment there isn't any way. The other thing I would tell you is this, Charles, that I think some of these statements that we're hearing from the Ukrainians about a new Russian offensive is really to keep European interest and American interest in actually backing the Ukrainians, because for sure, with what's going on in Europe with gas supplies and recession, interest is surely waning. And indeed, I spoke to an official in the Ukrainian government press office last week. He was asking me about how my experiences were in Ukraine when I was there. And he said to me, John, do you think that the journalists are now losing interest in Ukraine? And I said, well, no, of course not. The journalists are not. But you have to be aware of the news agenda, and there are other big things happening in the world. So I think the Ukrainian government is very, very aware that it needs to keep the profile high, and that would account certainly for this statement and other statements by senior figures in Ukraine about this new Russian offensive in the new year.
And John, meanwhile, Ukrainian cities have continued to come under aerial attack from the Russians. We understand the city of Kherson has been left without electricity after Russian missiles struck its energy facilities.
That's right. And as I said a short time ago, the Russians now seem to be ramping up the pressure on the Ukrainians. Is it to drive them to the negotiating table? Are they trying to completely collapse the morale of the Ukrainian people and force politically Zelensky to come to negotiations? The talks that I alluded to a short time ago, I don't know. It's hard to say, because to really know what's going on, you have to know what's going on in the Kremlin, and it's such an opaque place, and who knows what's going on in Putin's head. And remember, he has amazing training by the KGB in bluff and counter bluff, and understanding human nature. A very complex character in charge in the Kremlin at the moment.
And of course, John, more than most, you have a good sense of what is going on in Ukraine and what went on there. As you said, you reported from Ukraine for Arise. I recall interviewing you. You were in Kyiv, you were in Lviv and other parts of the country. You were there at the beginning of that invasion. We're now at the end of the year. You've covered so much of this war. How do you see the year in Ukraine?
Well, if you'd asked me that 2 weeks ago, I would say that after a terrible 10 months, I think the end may be in sight, that there may be some peace deal being talked about in some back rooms in Washington and Moscow. Now, and especially this week, all that has changed. I think the chance of Ukraine winning this war is not good. The Russians have the greater firepower. They can attack from the air. We've seen the impact of those drones supplied by Iran on cities in Ukraine, and the huge impact that can have on the Ukrainian people. And again, we have to look back on, Putin. What does he want? Because for Putin, it's far more than an invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine he regards as being part of the old Russian Empire. For Putin, though, it's more than that. He's taken on the West and NATO here. And from his point of view, he's trying to push back Western influence in Eastern Europe. And he said today that the Ukrainian war will continue, and he's looking east to make new friends and to increase trade with China. So, in summary, Putin, to me at the moment, is holding all the cards. It's his war to lose at the moment. Meanwhile, the West and NATO are still supplying billions and billions of dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine, and sadly on the ground that means death and destruction and the so-called meat grinder for the forces, and death and destruction to the civilians.
John, thanks very much indeed. John Cookson, Arise chief correspondent, talking to me there about the latest around Ukraine.